Community College family, it's nice to have you here this morning. For those who don't know, I am Monty Hickman, the Executive Director for Strategic Enrollment Management. And one thing we have done for those who may be new in the admissions and registrars family, we generally have periodic calls where we talk about the needs of the community college offices, your respective offices, or some of the policies that have changed or need to change. And we also at times ask our esteemed colleagues, such as Ms. Amanda Toller, who's the Director of Compliance for the Community College System Office, to come in and share with you some of the things that you all need to know. So, for this instance, we're looking at some of the top compliance findings for the community colleges. And so she agreed to do that with us today. I am recording, so if you would please um, mute your phones if you're not speaking. If you do have to leave, please do not put us on hold um, or if you have having conversations, you're not on mute, please put yourself on mute because we are recording and that will be recorded in perpetuity for everyone to hear. In addition, I tried to attach the slide deck. Hey, Angela. I need to cut this off too, so it won't give us that. It's telling us now who's joining. It shouldn't be what it is. I also tried to attach the presentations in the chat, but for some reason it won't upload. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to email the slides to everyone in the calendar invite again. So do me a favor, please do not accept the calendar invite because it'll flood my inbox with all the calendar accepts or denies. So just use that once you get it to have a copy of the slides from Ms. Toller. So with that being said, I am going to transition over to Ms. Toller and give her control of the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Hickman. We appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Right.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. I have the first slide has a list of my name and it has a list of all the compliance examiners. We're also going to have a contact information at the end of the slide. This is we're going to have a couple of slides that discuss what we're finding across the state. I want everyone to please pay attention to this first slide. This is very important. Kudos to Sabra Matney for helping us find this, kind of brings your attention to it. Please make sure that you're signing your attendance records. They must be signed and verified by the instructor who taught the class. It has to be the instructor who taught the class. It can't be the dean, the director, anyone like that. It doesn't work if you say, well, that class finished in March of 2025, and when we tried to go get it signed in May, right before the ICR was due, the instructor had left. So not only do you need to make sure that your attendance records are signed and verified by the instructor who taught the class, they need to be signed by the instructor who taught the class as soon as the class is over. Now, that being said, it is okay if your rosters are signed later, unless you've already received your sample for the compliance review to begin. But it is, you never know what's going to happen to an instructor, whether they're going to leave, get another job. So please make sure that you are getting your instructors to sign the roster when the class is over. For curriculum, you can get them to sign at the census date, and Con Ed signs at the end of the class. So these are the top compliance issues that we've noted in continuing education. Instructor payment. That means whether it's your instructor works for the college or whether it's a professional service agreement. We need to see that the instructor of record was paid to teach the number of hours that the class was held. So if your instructor works for the college, whether they're a full-time instructor or a part-time instructor, we need to see a contract in there. If they are a full-time instructor, it is best if you have a no-pay contract, but you don't have to have a no-pay contract, but that is a best practice. For full-time employees, if you put a no-pay contract in there, we need to know how many hours that instructor was responsible for. We're seeing that registration fee payments are not being made, whether that's the prison, the third party, a student the sponsorship, fee waiver, whatever. We need to make sure that we're seeing payment for the instructor being paid, and the student has to pay for the class. And those things need to be documented in the file when we get there. Any questions about payment so far? All right.
Oh man, I'm
Underage.
sorry. Someone
Uh-huh.
asked, "What's the screen to run CE underage reports?" And I
I
think
can't.
Brian McCullough just responded to her, so you're fine.
Oh, good,
Go.
because I can't remember.
For those who want to know, the screen is XPAO.
All right. For the underage reports, we have a slide in a little bit about overlap, but for underage reports in Con Ed, we need you to run those reports. Those reports should be, you should run those every semester. You should go through, you should look at it, you should answer any questions that may pop up. If you have a student who is under the age of 18, they're going to show up on that report. In the summer, a student who's under 16 can take a CSP class or an SEF class. They're also, but other than that, they shouldn't, no one except for FIP classes, we'll talk about that, underage students shouldn't be taking those classes. There are some in the driving class, they can take the CSP and the class that in the fall and the spring. A student who's 15 years old can take certain FIP classes, and there is a numbered memo out there that lists those classes. It's just the number, the FIP prefix. So what we're finding is a lot of colleges are having 15-year-olds take like an SAF class or like the wildlife fire classes. They should not be taking those classes. It's only the class that offers the FIP classes. And for those, they cannot take a live burn class, and they cannot take the driving class. So please make sure you're running these reports. They should be run after the end of the semester. And please give us your working copies of that. If you have something on there that you have a 15-year-old who accidentally took an SAF class, but you removed them from the class, then we need to know that. So you just write student not reported, removed from ICR. It's also helpful if you'll put that information in the file so that if we happen to pull that file, we can see that they were not reported. So do we have any questions about any of the underage reports? Okay. Scheduled hours and hours miscalculated. Usually when we find that the hours are miscalculated, that's a CCR issue. And some of you may be dealing with CCR, some of you aren't, but it's a lot of those are contact hour classes where they're miscalculated. There are contact hour classes in Con Ed, so please make sure if you have contact hour classes that you're checking to ensure that the hours were reported properly and that they were rounded to the quarter hour. Scheduled hours, we're finding a lot of scheduled hours that are incorrect. Please make sure you are training your instructors to know that they need to look at their contract, they need to know how many hours their class is held for, and they need to know how to figure out if those classes were held properly. I don't know whether a lot of colleges are doing training for instructors, but it's very important for them to understand how to check their scheduled hours, because they're going to be the ones that can correct that and make a note if they find that it's a 48-hour class and it was only scheduled for 40 hours. They can let someone know at the beginning of the class and get that corrected. A lot of times what we're finding with the scheduled hours is class was canceled for some reason and it was not made up. So if class is being canceled, whether it's a weather event or whether the instructor is out sick, or any other reason, then a note needs to be in there, and a note showing how the hours were made up or if it was made up. So your instructors should know that if something happens and they're not going to be able to make up those hours, they need to let somebody know so that the ICR can be adjusted. Their pay would need to be adjusted, um, so that it's noted on there that the scheduled hours were correct. The way we check scheduled hours are the same way you check scheduled hours. We're going to go through, look at each day, how many hours were held, and multiply it out. If you have any questions at any time about, scheduled hours, or if the hours are miscalculated, you're always welcome to reach out to your examiner for help. Does anyone have any questions about scheduled hours? All right. Clinical. We are going to need your clinical documentation. We need to see it. So it needs to be in the file when we are originally looking at the file. So when you're pulling your records together for the compliance review, it needs to be in the file. I would also suggest that it needs to be in the file before that when the person who's reporting the ICR is checking it. So please make sure that you have your clinical documentation, you're getting it from your instructor. If you're not keeping it in the class file, you're keeping it in a safe location, because for every class that has clinicals, we're going to check. And we are starting to find that a lot of times that we're missing that documentation.
Amanda, we do have Kenny. He did provide the memo for students who are 15-year-old students. Also, there's a hand raised
Okay.
by Anastasia. Do you have a question?
Looks like Miss Anastasia put her question in the chat.
Okay, here you go. If a class is scheduled for a certain amount of hours but is adjusted by the end, should the class be rebuilt?
No, you don't have to rebuild it. If you rebuild the class, I think that can cause some unintended consequences. So if you have a class that is supposed to be a 48-hour class and something happens and it was only held for 40 and there's no way that you can make that up, you can just make a note on the ICR. You can adjust it on the ICR. You don't have to rebuild it.
Okay, and Michelle Sullivan has a question also.
Hi, Amanda. My question is about the clinicals. So we have a class that was run, oh gosh, fall semester. And this was a first time CE class. And my question is, the clinical hours were not documented appropriately. So is it okay for me to back out? It's a membership hour class. The clinical hours are a part of the total number of hours for that class. Is it okay for me to back out just those clinical hours for all of the students, or do I need to take out all of the hours? So the clinical hours were like 80, and I think the other hours were 80. So I think it's like a 160-hour class. Is it okay for me to just back out the hours for the clinical that was not documented properly, or do I need to take out the full hours?
No, you can just adjust the hours that you don't have documentation for. But if you have any documentation for, some of the hours. So let's say if you can't find, you can only find 10 hours for one student. You can count those hours. You can count whatever you can find documentation for, and then you can just make an adjustment for the other ones.
Okay, so great. I can make an adjustment or a correction on the spring ICR when I submit that. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Years ago, it used to be that folks would, if it was a class in the fall, they would hold it and make an adjustment in the fall. You can make an adjustment. You have 3 semesters to make an adjustment. It's better if you will go ahead and make an adjustment as you go. That way you don't have to hold on to the class and keep up with it for a year. You don't forget it. You don't win the lottery and move on and the adjustment doesn't get made. So yes, it's better to go ahead and make the adjustment as soon as you can.
Okay. Well, I made the adjustment. So what I did, I took off 80 hours for all of the students, even though I may have had documentation showing that maybe one student had 50 hours, one student had 30 hours. I just removed all 80 for the fall, so I can go back and add in the hours that I can document.
You could, yes, and just
Okay.
make sure you're putting the documentation of those adjustments in the file.
I can do that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, you have a question by Susan Barrett. I think she put in the chat too. If clinicals are held off campus, are signatures required?
From a compliance standpoint, we just need documentation that it'll be on the attendance roster and then the instructor will sign that. So for example, if you have an EMS class, compliance is not going to look for the preceptor signature. That being said, I don't know what the requirements are for the external accrediting agencies. So I hesitate to say, no, you don't need preceptor signatures. You'd need to check with the area and the accrediting agency. But for compliance, for the community college compliance team, as long as that documentation is on the roster and the instructor has signed the roster, then that's what we're looking for.
Thank you.
For clinicals, we find class clinical overlap most of the time in EMS. So please make sure that you are looking at your EMS classes and you're looking at your clinicals and you're making sure that there's no overlap. It is okay for a student to miss class to go do clinicals, so long as it doesn't interfere with the requirements of the outside agency, and so long as it doesn't interfere with their ability to pass the class. It is not okay to have a student go have clinical hours during class time and report them both. So let's say that you have a student, you have an EMS class that is from 8 to 5, and the class is being held on 3/18. That student cannot be reported in the class from 8 to 5 and then also go to do clinical hours from 8 to 5 or any portion thereof. So if it was, they did 7 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock in the morning, that's still an overlap. You'd need to adjust that. We do understand that there are reasons why a student would need to miss class to go do clinicals. That isn't a college decision whether they can miss those hours. But if they are allowed to do that, then those hours must be adjusted. And you would need to do a manual adjustment on the ICR for that class and adjust the hours that actually overlap. So let's say we had a student who started at 8 p.m. on 3/17 and went to 8 a.m. on 3/18, and class starts at 8 a.m. Chances are that student is not going to walk out of where they were doing their clinicals and walk into class, but technically there's not an overlap. It's not advised because again, that student has to get to class, but in that case, you wouldn't have to do an overlap. But if you have a class where they started at 8 p.m. the night before and went to 12 p.m., then yes, you would have to make an adjustment for those 4 hours. We have had a lot of questions across the state. So I want to take a moment and just let everybody have an opportunity to ask any questions that you have about clinicals.
And you can put your questions in the chat if you need to, but feel comfortable. The whole point of this is for you to ask questions also. So if you
Yes,
have any.
we want this to be a benefit to everyone. We want to answer any question you may have.
Miss Amanda, this is Kenny. May I make one comment, please?
Yes, sir.
On the EMS piece, Miss Amanda and our team have been working very closely on this. We are trying to research some best practices to put out, and we hope probably in the month of May we'll be offering some professional development opportunities around clinical documentation for EMS programs, and some of that may, offer some thoughts about other program areas that have clinicals as well. But we'll continue to work with Miss Amanda's team to get something ready, hopefully in the May timeframe.
Typically, we're going to see class clinical overlap with the EMS classes. We also see clinicals like with your nursing assistant classes and with phlebotomy. Normally, with nursing assistant classes, what we're seeing is that the entire class goes to a facility at one time, and that should be documented somehow in the file. Usually, it should be built where you have your class time, then your clinical time, and then back to class time. Sometimes we'll see it on calendars. We do understand that for clinical documentation for nurse aid classes, that a lot of times you don't know where those students are going to be going. So we understand if the location is not listed, when the class is built, but at some point they will know where they're going, and so it can be written on the calendar or in somewhere else in the file. Phlebotomy, what we're seeing most of the time now is that either the phlebotomy class is an evening class and the clinical is done during the day, or if the phlebotomy class is a day class, there are a couple of weeks where class is not held, so that the students can get their clinical out of the way. But please make sure that you understand we're going to need those phlebotomy clinicals. With nurse aid, we usually look and see where the class was scheduled and where everyone went. But for EMS and phlebotomy, those are two that we are still not always getting documentation of clinicals. So please make sure that you maintain that documentation, and please make sure you're putting it in the class file.
Okay, question, Amanda, if a student in a clinical has 12.13, maybe I'm saying that wrong, we need those minutes to the exact number, correct?
If you're
Or are they
trying to,
rounding?
if you should round to the quarter hour.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
Robin, did it answer the question?
Yes, we had not been rounding, so good to know. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Independently scheduled class census date for those online classes where it is a totally online class, and this is going to be for CE and CCR. You're going to take the total number of hours that the class is held, divide by 4, and back up that many days. If it's a decimal, if it's 4.4, then it becomes 5 days. So please make sure that you're looking at those, that you're documenting your census date correctly, that you're maintaining attendance on your roster through the census date. Please make sure that you are maintaining your LMS documentation. For an online class, we need to make sure that we have the entry documentation. We didn't put this on this slide, but we are finding that if a student enters a blended or hybrid class, and they enter if it's a blended or hybrid class and they enter during the seated portion of the class, then we look at the entry on the roster. If they enter on an online day and they enter, through an assignment in the LMS, then we need that documentation. So please make sure that you're looking at your rosters, you're checking to see how your students entered, you're making sure that you have documentation. And please make sure you're saving that. One other thing that I would like to say is that I strongly suggest that you look at your files and make sure that they are complete prior to reporting them on the ICR. Make sure that your instructor pay is there. Make sure your student pay is there. Make sure the scheduled hours are correct. Make sure your clinical documentation is there. Make sure your LMS documentation is there. Please make sure everything is in the file before you submit it on the ICR. Now, that being said, sometimes there might be something that's missing that you're waiting for. You may not have gotten documentation from the business office that your PSA has been paid. You may be waiting on the prison to pay for your class. You can go ahead and report that class. You need to hold it out and make sure that you get that documentation. Make sure that the PSA is paid. Make sure that the prison does pay. It is very important to make sure that everything is correct. We're not going to, once your class ends this spring, compliance is not going to show up on campus looking at your spring 2025 records. It will be a while. You'll have enough time to get that information. But please make sure you're reviewing your files. Please make sure you're checking your ICR against your files. Make sure if a class is reported on the ICR, you have a file for it. Please make sure you're checking to ensure that it hasn't been reported twice. We're going to move on to curriculum next. So if you have any more Con Ed questions, let's talk about them, but we'll have some time at the end. So if something comes up and you think about it, we can answer it in a bit. So are there any more Con Ed questions right this minute?
There was one more in the chat, Miss Amanda.
Yeah, Amanda, using the formula dividing by 4, is that for the membership hours classes or CCR?
It for a completely online class, you're going to take the total number of hours that the class is being reported for. So yes, it would be a membership hour class. You're going to divide by 4 and back it up. You would not do this. Is just for the completely online class.
Okay, Amanda, so my question is if it's a contact hour CCR class, we're not having to do that. Is that correct?
That's correct. If it is a contact hour class, then we need to see time in and time out for your online hours.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we move on to curriculum? Okay. Here are the compliance issues that we're finding. CCP students are enrolled in classes outside of their approved pathways. Please make sure that your document, if a student has finished the pathway and they've moved on, make sure you're noting that. Please make sure if you're doing the CCP information at your college that you are saving a spreadsheet each semester. When you try to pull an informal report, once you get your compliance information, it gives inaccurate information. So if you will save a spreadsheet with all of your students for each semester, once everyone is in the pathway that they're supposed to be in, and provide that to the compliance examiner, that makes it much easier for us. You should be checking. And I know that colleges have a lot of CCP students. But we are finding some colleges that are reporting a fairly high number of hours outside of the pathway. So please make sure that you're checking to ensure that your CCP students are in the correct pathway and that their classes are correct.
Amanda, I'm gonna go back 1 second to see you again. So Karen asks, divide by 10 for synchronous, blended, and hybrid courses, correct?
For hybrid and blended classes, there is nothing in the code that specifically states how a census date should be determined. So that right now the guidance is that it will be determined by the college. So however each college determines it should be set is the way it should be set. It just needs to make sure that you're standardized across the board. So it shouldn't be that EMS calculates their classes this way and phlebotomy classes are done another way and nursing classes are a different way. It should be standardized.
Thanks.
Another issue in curriculum is that we're finding scheduled hours are not correct. Your instructors should look at their roster and be able to determine if the class hours are scheduled properly. So please make sure that your instructors are being trained on how to determine scheduled hours and that they're checking their roster. Another issue is prison payment. Again, just like we discussed in Con Ed, we check to make sure that if a class was held in a prison, that the Department of Public Safety has paid the tuition. We understand that the prison pays when the prison pays. And sometimes that is not exactly what the colleges would like for it to be. They kind of have when they cut a check, they're going to cut a check. So they may not pay until after the census day. They may not pay until after the class is over. It may be after the ICR is submitted. You can report that class on the ICR, but you need to hold it and make sure that the prison is paying for their classes. Any questions about that? It's beginning to be a bit of a problem for colleges that are offering classes in prison, and it can cause a lot of angst when they don't pay and can lead to either a preliminary, minimal, or material finding. So does anyone have any questions about prison payment for students?
Beth has a recommendation. She said she's got a schedule hour CU calculator that she'd be happy to share with anyone who wants it or who wants to demo it, and just email her at her email address. Her email address is in the chat.
All right. Anybody got any other questions so far with 1, 2, or 3? If not, we're moving on to number 4. Number of students at the census. We do find that sometimes a traditional class is reported incorrectly, but most of the time when we're having students who are reported incorrectly at the census,
Okay,
it is
the last time we did one of these,
it is reported incorrectly because we don't have LMS documentation. So please make sure that soon after the census day, your instructors are capturing that LMS documentation. We can go back. Sometimes we can go back and say, hey, can you get your IT staff to go in and check? Because a lot of times they're bumped off of the LMS documentation if they've withdrawn. So the sooner you print that off and save it, the better. So please make sure that you're checking to make sure that your students that if it's an online or they entered in a hybrid class online or a blended class, that you have that documentation and that you're saving it and that you're including it with your records. And would you please make sure that it's big enough to read? Across the state, we're finding that it's size 8 font, and that's just not sustainable for us. So please make sure that it's big enough for us to read. Any questions about LMS documentation? All right. Incomplete attendance records. Incomplete attendance records means it's not signed. It doesn't have a P. It doesn't have an E. It doesn't have anything showing entry for one or all of the students. It means that we can't get to the scheduled hours. Most of the time when we say there was incomplete attendance records, we're saying that the instructor did not sign the roster or the instructor did not put anything on the roster showing entry for the students. So please make sure that your instructors understand that they have to record attendance on the attendance record.
Amanda.
Yes, sir.
Someone asked, do the compliance auditors have a preferred way of reviewing the LMS documentation, such as PDF or spreadsheets?
We do not. We don't. That's a college decision. We either way, as long as it's big enough for us to read, that's fine. I do know that Kathy Davis has worked with IntelliBoard to work on getting a system. If you all haven't heard of it or you all are not using it, then I suggest you reach out to Kathy about talking about that. And she can do a much better job of explaining that, but it is supposed to help with pulling the LMS documentation. And it is free to the colleges. For WBL documentation, we're missing workbooks or timesheets. We understand that you may not have an entire workbook that's completed by a student, especially if they didn't complete their work-based learning assignment. But what we do need to see is that they did an orientation to enter the class or begin the work experience prior to the census. The way we see that is that we see a timesheet. So best suggestion is after the first week of work, you ask your student to go ahead and send in a timesheet. I can't tell you the number of times that we hear, well, the student never finished it and they never brought us back the timesheet. You may not report a student if you do not have documentation that that student entered prior to the census and began the work experience. If you don't have those two things, you can't report that student. The team and I have usually go and do the work-based learning conference. I think most recently it was held in November. If anyone on this call is not a part of, if you deal with WBL and you're not a part of that group, then I suggest you reach out to them. They do a great job. The conference is very informative, and it's a great group to reach out and talk to and get best practices.
Amanda, are electronic signatures okay, provided the college has a policy for CE and CU?
Yes, electronic signatures are fine so long as it follows your internal policy.
Okay, great. Susan has a question also. Well, no, Sharon has a question.
Hello. So my question is with attendance records. Sometimes when we have a class and it has multiple online attendance records, and some of them are done complete, correct weekly attendance, and then there are additional ones that are blank. How should we be addressing this? Is that an issue? Do we need to make sure that they are completing all their spreadsheets, or is it sufficient?
Well, bottom basement, we need them entered on one. So yes, if you have multiple rosters and they just entered the attendance on one, that's okay. We suggest that you make sure that if you have a class like a hybrid class or a blended class, that they are noting attendance in both the online and the seated portion. If something happens and you lose that LMS documentation, the instructor never kept it, you know, whatever, then you've got them entered in that seated portion. But as long as we can find them on one piece of the roster, then we will report them, you know, along, you know, if it's an online piece, then we make sure we have the LMS documentation.
I think the issue is multiple online. So there's a lab, there's a lecture, then there's another lab or lecture, online portions, and some of them are complete and some of them are just, there's nothing there.
Well, again, as long as we can get to it on one, that's okay, unless that goes against your internal policy. You know,
Okay.
But what we say is that it's better if you have them entering in all areas just to cover yourself.
Okay.
So one is fine, two is good, three is better.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anastasia, you have a question? She had, let's see. I think she put it in chat. Orientation will be required prior to starting on site. So their first attendance would have to be the orientation date, correct?
For a WBL, when you do your orientation, so long as it's not before the class begins, that enters the student into the class. Then they also must begin the work experience.
Okay.
But they can enter the class with the orientation and then begin the work experience after the census day. But if they don't do a work experience, I mean, if they don't do an orientation or the orientation is before the first day of class, then they would need to begin their work experience after the census or during the census period.
Okay. Courtney asked for number one, the spreadsheet that you were talking about. Did you say after each semester, save a spreadsheet of the student and the pathways?
Usually you can do it after your last census date. Once all of your CCP students have sort of landed where they need to land, then you can go ahead and save it then. But it could be after the end of the semester. What you don't want to do is do it before they end up where they need to be.
Okay. And also, just to clarify what Amanda just said, in order to count WBL, we must attend the orientation and begin work by the census.
Well, no, they don't have to attend an orientation and begin the work experience. They could do their orientation first, or they could start their work experience.
So it's an or, not it's an and an or, not just
right. It could be, but they must at some point begin the work experience. So let's say they enter during the census period with an orientation. There must be documentation that they started the work experience. Now, if they've entered in the census period with the orientation, that work experience could begin after the census date. But they have to do the work, they have to have worked.
Okay. Can a WBL orientation be online?
Yeah, that's fine. They just need documentation for it.
Okay. For OL, I guess online and hybrid classes, can't read today. For online and hybrid classes, is it okay for the instructor to submit the self-service census class certification on the day of census?
Technically, you're certifying it after the last, after the class. So it would be better if it was the day after, but most of the time we don't see that. We see it after the day of the census. But if we saw it, we would just, that's fine. But it really needs to be after, because you're not truly certifying whether that the student entered or didn't withdraw on the census.
Okay, that's the last question so far.
Okay. For independent studies, you have to have time in and out documentation. We typically, if the sample has pulled a class with one student, my examiners and I are always going to say, hey, is this an independent study? Sometimes classes are just a class with one student. But an independent study might have more than one student in it, but usually they just have one, and we're always going to ask. But if it is an independent study, you can't report all of the hours. You only report the hours that you have time in and time out documentation. So usually we will see time in and time out. We don't see as many independent studies as we used to. But again, you got to have the time in and time out. And then for your clinical documentation, again, we need that to begin with. When you're pulling your sample, go ahead and get the clinical documentation, whether it's a nursing class or radiography or sonography, EMS, whatever it is. We're going to need that clinical documentation. We don't say that you have to reinvent the wheel. There doesn't have to be documentation for compliance and then also for the outside accrediting agency, but it does need to be clear enough where we can understand it. But do understand that if we have a question, we're just going to ask you. So you just need to make sure that that your nursing faculty are there to answer any questions that we may have. If we can't understand it, we're just going to ask you for clarification. And I do want to make everyone understand, we do all 58 colleges. There's a lot of different ways to do everything in Con Ed, curriculum, CCR. Just because we're asking a question doesn't mean it's incorrect. It just means we don't understand. So don't worry if we're asking questions. That doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It just means we don't understand what your documentation lists. So does anyone have any questions about the CU stuff before we move on to a short slide about the overlap report?
A couple. So, where did it go? So if the independent study is fully online, can the course logs be used instead of time in, time out documentation?
No, an independent study is a contact hour class, so it can be online, but we need the documentation showing the time in and time out.
I think that's it, because I think Brian answered the other ones.
Let me, if you don't mind though, Dr. Hickman, I'll explain that because Jennifer asked a follow-up question. So when we're
Okay.
talking about the ability in colleague to make sure that an instructor cannot certify their census until at least one day after their census date has ended, that ability doesn't exist today. I posted an idea, a Lucian Customer Center idea that was submitted by one of your colleagues within the system, asking, can you just let us add what's need to be added, which is just a negative number. If we could just add a -1 to a certain field, the days prior to enable certification, we could change that from a 0, which lets the instructor certify no sooner than the day of census. If they let us use a -1, then that would force it to let the instructor certify no sooner than at least one day after. So feel free, if you have access to the Customer Center, to upvote that idea. We have a lot of power in North Carolina to get Lucian to move on some of these things, and then that would be an option maybe in the future in colleague, so that the instructor would have to wait to certify at least one day after the census passes for their course. So hopefully that answers your question, Jennifer. We can't set a date. It's still going to be the position, but the issue is that we can't add a negative in the days prior to enable certification to force that certification at least one day after.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you,
Melissa,
Brian.
you have a question?
Yes, and it's a question and a clarification, kind of both, and I'm scared to even mention it. But Amanda, I appreciate you having this, and you're always very helpful when I have questions about things. But there was a discussion back in December at the Health Science Deans meetings about clinical hours, and I know that State Board Code is not very clear, but there was a discussion that some clinical hours are 50 minutes and some clinical hours are 60 minutes. And I don't want anybody to misunderstand anything and get into some compliance issues. So can you speak to that about the membership versus contact hours? Because I know there have been differing policies even in the years that I've been with the system.
Yes, thank you. Sure. If the class is a contact hour class, it is a 60-minute hour. That's in code. Clinicals, if they are attached with a membership hour class, for example, a nursing class or a radiography class, the clinicals should be 60-minute hours. Admittedly, that's not clear, specifically spelled out in the code, but that is the way that the hours are supposed to be. I think there's some work, or we need to do some work to update the code, but clinical documentation needs to show 60-minute hours.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks for the clarification.
Sure. Let's move on to everyone's favorite overlap. Please make sure that you're giving us the working copy. If you just print off a blank copy for us, it looks nice. It doesn't help me at all. I need to know. I need it to be ugly. I need it to be all marked up. I need it to have tears and blood on it so that I can see that you've worked it and that you've made the adjustments. You should document the hours that are adjusted. It's helpful if you'll put them in the file so that we know. I went to a college a number of years ago and I said, well, when you made the adjustments on here, can you show documentation where you did that? They did not. They were like, what do you mean? And so you need to make the adjustments. If you find that there are overlaps, you need to adjust those hours. You need to adjust the hours that's in the best interest of the college. If that means that you're taking them off in continuing education, that's fine. But if you don't want to take all of the hours constantly in Con Ed, years and years ago, Con Ed was going to take all of the adjustments no matter what, but it doesn't have to be that way anymore. So what you should do is do it again in the best interest of the college. And the folks in curriculum, CCR and Con Ed should sit down and work on it together. You do your own area, and then when there are hours that are in multiple areas, you've got something in Con Ed and you've got something in curriculum, then sit down and work on it. If Con Ed has taken the last 7 or 8, 10 students, then maybe curriculum needs to take one. But that again is according to you, what your policy is. Please remember, it's about the class, not about the student. If the class overlaps, the hours have to be adjusted. What we're finding now is that folks are saying, well, the student missed my Con Ed class, or the student missed my curriculum class to go to the Con Ed class. No, there is an overlap. It is about the class, not about the student. Please remember, if you don't remember anything else, sign your rosters, and it's about the class, not about the student. And please make sure you're using these date ranges. They are in the code. These are the dates for that should be the date ranges that need to be used. We typically don't have as much of a problem in continuing education as we do in curriculum. A lot of times in curriculum, what folks want to do is they put the date range of their semester. It's about the full semester. So those dates are listed here. Make sure you're using those dates. Any questions about overlap? Okay, y'all are having a lot of problems across the state, but maybe you're just, absorbing all of this information. But please make sure that it can get kind of confusing at the end of the semester when the ICR is due and you're trying to look at an overlap. If you ever have any questions, then reach out to someone on the compliance team. We'll be glad to help you.
Amanda,
Yes.
hey, this saying at Federal Tech. Are you gonna send out or we can check back on the system to see like when you're up next for your audit? Usually I see a schedule of some sort.
We don't have a schedule. We have an internal schedule.
Okay.
And so what we do is we contact the college 4 weeks in advance and give the president and the president's assistant an email and say, these are the dates that we'd like to come. And then once the president approves it, then we say 2 weeks before we're going to send the sample of everything. Sometimes we have to change our schedule, so we don't like to put the dates out there. Say, for example, this year we had some of our Western colleges throughout the year, but we moved all of the Western colleges to the end of the year, so because they had been impacted by the hurricane. So we don't like to put it out because sometimes it changes. Hopefully we don't have another change like that for the hurricane, but so we don't have our schedule out there. You can look at the numbered memo that comes out in August. Dr. Gold sends out a numbered memo at the beginning of the compliance review year, and that will list all of the colleges that are going to have a compliance review. So you'll know whether you're going to be during that year. I will say that if you know something that's coming up that's going to impact your compliance review, if you have someone on your team, like your curriculum registrar or your Con Ed registrar, or someone who's vitally important to making sure that the compliance review is held, is going to have something come up, like you're going to have surgery, then reach out to your compliance examiner and let us know so that we can kind of work around that, because we can try to mitigate those issues and try to help work with people. Here are some best practices that we have. You've seen this before when we do the regional trainings. We've put this out there. So I'm going to leave this up for a minute. I do want to say that we are going to be conducting our regional training sessions again this summer. They're going to be in July and August. We're confirming with all of the colleges about the specific dates, and I'll be getting an email out to the presidents and the president's assistants soon about those particular dates. We have had good representation for the past. We've done this. This will be our third year doing this, and so we're going to try to have 6 this year. Last year we had 4. We're going to try to have 6. If you are interested in having a compliance review, I know nobody wants to have a compliance review on their campus. If you're interested in having a training session on your campus, just for your staff, and let us know, reach out to us. We do that. We do that throughout the year as we go along. If we've got one coming up at a college next week, they ask us to come in and do that. So we're always glad to do training throughout the year. One of the new things for those of you who have had a compliance review, you know this. For those of you who are going to have one this year or ongoing, one of the new things that we're doing is we're going to come in at the very beginning. We're going to talk to you about your compliance review, but then we're going to try to set a date. We're doing individual college trainings. We typically are on campus for 2 weeks doing a compliance review, and toward the end of that second week, we are doing a compliance review at your college. We have a short slide. It takes about maybe 30 to 45 minutes, and then we open up the floor for questions. That's been very well received. So we're trying to make sure that we're at reaching everyone that we can. We understand that sometimes during the summer, not people are taking vacations or whatever, so you can't come to that. So we're trying to make sure that we're having more training opportunities. I do want to make sure that you all see this again. Please make sure that your instructors are signing their rosters. If you are on the schedule for the remainder of this semester, please go back and look at your rosters. If you haven't received a time from your examiner saying this is when you're going to have your review, you can go back and get an instructor to sign it. Once you receive the documentation saying these are the records that are being in your sample, you can't change it. But I cannot stress to you enough that we are having a lot of problems with instructors not signing their rosters. Please, 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 I beg you, go back and make sure that your rosters are signed. If they are not signed, call the instructor in and get them to sign it. Here's our contact information. If you're going to contact us, it's easier if you would send us an email. We're not in our offices all the time, and I am particularly bad about checking my phone messages. But if you send me an email and say, hey, I have a question, we can set up a time to talk. If you send me something that says, hey, I got a question, here it is, that's great. If you send me an email that says, hey, I've got a question that's a little complicated, I need to have a conversation with you, we'll do that. If you say, I've got a group of folks that need to meet you, can we have a Teams call? We can do that. If you say, hey, we'd like for you to come visit us on our campus and ask some questions, we can do that. We are working very hard to make sure that everyone across the state understands that we are really here to help you. A lot of times everybody says, oh, well, it's just kind of a gotcha moment. That is not the case. We want to help you make sure that you're reporting the hours properly. We don't want your hours over-reported or under-reported. So please make sure that you are reaching out to us. We are really here to help you and answer your compliance questions. If you ask us a question and we don't know the answer, we will do our very best to find the person at the system office that we need to talk to.
You got 2 more questions.
Okay, what are they?
One is, can rosters be formatted to align with FGRN such that the instructor certifies the total number of seat hours that the student attended, or must the roster show hours for each date they attended as well as the total hours for each student?
Brian, I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
It's for contact hours specifically. So like they could, FGRN just a screen that shows a total contact hour for each student versus like they attended 2 hours this day, 3 hours this day, and then the total at the end, which would be what we call XATT2. So I think they're asking, it's just showing the total hours for a student on a one screen, one roster, and not each day they attended that adds up to the total. Is that okay?
As long as we can get to the total hours, but if there are multiple pages, then the instructor would have to sign everything, I think, if I'm understanding that correctly. And I'm really not sure
Yeah.
that I am.
Yeah, one is a more aggregated list that shows the hours broken down. One is just more, aggregated. One is aggregated with the total. One is just shows hours as they're broken down to the total.
Yeah, as long as we can get to the total hours and everything is signed properly.
Okay.
But usually what we see with contact hours and curriculum is an XATT2 with
Okay.
the hours for each student noted.
Is an electronic signature okay for rosters?
As long as it follows your electronic signature policy, yes.
Okay. Does the final attendance roster need to be stated?
In curriculum, we need, yeah, they normally, the final attendance, we're going to need the final attendance roster in curriculum because we need to check scheduled hours, but normally it is certified at the census date. In Con Ed, we're looking for the roster to be signed on or after the end of the class.
Okay. If a CE class is held online synchronously, like MS Teams, are stats required? We know they are needed for asynchronous hours like Brightspace, but couldn't find anything in code specifically about online synchronous.
Usually if it's online synchronous, a lot of times, especially if it's like CCR, they'll have the documentation, but the time in and time out. But if it's a CE class that's held synchronously, we usually don't have EMS, not EMS, LMS documentation. The instructor will just record the attendance just like they would if it was a face-to-face seated class.
Okay. If the instructor signs the attendance roster but puts a date prior to the last date of class, is that acceptable? My question is regarding CE classes.
It's not the end of the world. We would have a conversation and say, hey, your instructor needs to understand that class is certified at the end of the class. If everything is like that, then yes, there's a problem. But usually what we have found is that when colleges went to self-service rosters in Con Ed, they didn't realize that in Con Ed, that self-service is set up for curriculum, and so it would certify at the census, but in Con Ed, it should be certified at the end of the class.
Okay. All right. So Amanda, what I'm going to do is let me see. Someone has a question first before I do this. If CE audit files are scanned using, let's see, it goes up. If CE files are scanned using document management systems for compliance review, would the compliance officers need the original paper copy and file?
Well, we need a paper copy because right now we do paper copies. So my suggestion is if you're going to scan your rosters, you save your paper documentation until after your compliance review. Then you would provide those files. Otherwise, if you have scanned all of your records and destroyed your original paper documentation, you're just going to have to print everything out for us. So you're kind of wasting paper and print and all of that. It's better off just saving the originals for us. But if you have, if you've destroyed everything, you can certainly print everything out for us.
Okay. They asking a lot of questions at the end. I love it. At the July presentation, it was emphasized that the instructor should print his or her name as well as sign if his or her signature is illegible. Do personnel need to print and sign timesheets, contracts, and rosters?
No, we're just looking at the attendance. We should be able to see who signed it, but this is just for the attendance roster. We need to make sure that the instructor signed it. And sometimes it's just a line. And so we need to make sure that if they sign it where you can't read their name, then they should print it underneath on the roster.
Okay. For CE clinical based on cases and not hours, how do we prove the student met the total number of hours reported for the class?
That's probably going to be like phlebotomy, where they have to get a certain number of sticks. There should still be a certain number of hours that they do. So whatever the hours that are being reported for that class, we should be able to see documentation for that many hours. But it may be
Okay.
that you have more, especially, and Kenny, you may need to help me out. There are a certain number of things that you have to get done when you're doing EMS. So there may be more. There may be less for that matter, but you should show us that the hours were scheduled properly.
Yeah, I think to the question, I think you were spot on to begin with. There may be others, but I know phlebotomy, that can be a challenge sometimes. But you scheduled your hours out when you built your schedule in your course section. And so if they get done early, then that may need to be documented from an hours perspective. But largely still, they're going to be scheduled to be at a clinic from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., right? With EMS, largely you are correct in what you said, but largely still it's around hours. It certainly can be more hours, but likely would not be less because all of the governing regulatory language is around hours.
Sometimes with phlebotomy, we will see that somebody didn't do all 40, but usually that's not the case with every single student. And then with curriculum, you've got those outside governing agencies as well. And so you need to make sure, bottom line, if you are reporting hours for clinical, then they need to be held.
For CU online course entry, does the online activity have to be a grade submission, or can we use a non-grade activity?
It should be it's supposed to be a graded activity.
Okay. Can we include students if they signed the registration application after the class census date, excuse me?
As long as they entered, we're looking at the roster to make sure that they entered prior to the census.
Okay. Amanda just mentioned that attendance in self-service is verified at census for CU classes. If CE is going to use self-service attendance, can an adjustment be made so that the attendance is verified at the end of the course, or is this a non-issue?
Attendance must be verified for continuing education at the end of the class.
Okay. That is the last question that I see. What I'm going to do, everyone, is if you want to stay on just for a second, I am going to stop recording. And